Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome to the stream. We are here with SparkRip. Spark, thanks for taking time out of your day to talk with me, man.
Yes, no worries.
Now,
Glad to be here.
we've ran together before. I pulled you into like a bait run of some sort, right?
Dreadcell Reef, I think. Yeah.
Which I think we progged on the twins for a couple hours. So you're someone who also appreciates going with new groups every now and again.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe
um,
not twins specifically, but yes.
Come on, man. You don't want to prog on the twins for 2 hours straight?
The thing is with twins and generally like fights where things are out really outside of my control, like it's a lot more fun for me when I can at least like help the group by doing more mechanics than I'm supposed to. In twins, it's literally like people just need to do their job. If they don't do their job, they wipe.
Yeah.
So those fights are more of a just you're waiting on them to realize how to do it rather than actively really helping them out and getting through it.
Yeah, I've been with groups where they've been like, "Oh, we did this fine the other day," and it's like, "Yeah, that's because these three people were doing 90% of the mechanics or whatever."
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, today we're talking about damage mitigation, and I want to kind of catch people up who maybe don't know what's going on. So, can you give us a little? Actually, I'm sorry. Is there any? Introduce yourself, if you will. Tell us a bit about you so that we know who you are.
Well, I'm Spark, or I go by Spark. I've been tanking for, well, I've been playing this game for almost 5 years, and I've
Wow.
been tanking for most of it. Um, there's not much else to it. Recently I decided to make something a bit more concrete to help myself and others in general to tank. It started off with this little reduction versus regen sheet I have here. Well, I say little, but it was my first time using Excel, and because everyone always asked like, what's better, cost reduction or magic or regen? So I wanted like a definitive answer,
Okay.
and I got it on paper, but I didn't really want to redo the whole calculation every single time for every single tune and situation. So I was like, what's the best way to do it? And I thought about Excel, and then the good thing with Excel is that you can share it with others. So that's kind of how this sheet came to be. And
Awesome.
then after I made one, I was like, well, why stop at one? And then I started making a bunch, and then I just got to mitigation eventually. And that's
Okay.
how I started. That's how we got into it.
Okay, cool. And do you mind on the cost reduction and harmony versus regen? Could you just because I looked at this earlier and what
Hmm.
are the key things here when if someone's like looking at this because I left a link to this spreadsheet which is awesome that you created this and you're willing to share it with the community. But can you just walk us through the key things if I don't know anything about this and I just want some basic answers, where do I look here?
All right. So I try, if not explaining it, then if it's very hard to understand, I usually will add a comment, like right here. If it's something I think you'll pick up just by looking at it, I usually don't write anything, but just read the labels is my biggest suggestion. And then just go down the list. So here it just says flat. Well, I guess flat doesn't explain much, but it just means the flat region. This is the base region that then gets multiplied later.
Yeah, some
But this is
number
just
of
the list.
regen being added in here,
Yeah,
not
so
some
this is just
percentage
like
or
a.
anything else.
Could you say that again?
Not some the flat regen. Most of this is not like a percentage based thing. These are
No,
actual
so none of
numbers.
it is
Yeah,
percentage.
yeah,
Yeah, these are all numbers. So if you just go down the list, it's base regen, which is something every single character has. You can't turn it off. Eternarch, Divines, if you're using Eternarch, Urzogas, Red Frothgar, Urzoga's Bear Hunt, Jerusalem Israel, essentially the three tank foods that people use.
yeah.
Well,
And then you've got your total
mhm,
base regen there at the bottom, and then you've got looks like some multipliers for various classes,
this,
various buffs,
yep.
and then you just total that up.
So, so yeah, the idea is to kind of track every single source of incoming magicka. So while mag regen makes a good portion of it, it's not everything, which is this section right here. This is magicka outside of mag region, which is magicka steel, your potion, argonian if you have it, constitution, balance, sorcery bait passive, combustion, and nightblade are the ones I have here.
Cool. And it looks like your result there on the bottom right. So uh,
Mm-hmm.
fairly close, depending on what's going on. Uh, which one is better?
So So in this particular instance, let me just run it through. We have the base region, Ancient Arc, Red Frothgar. So if we have Red Frothgar, the others aren't in play. I'm gonna pretend we're in 7 heavy, so no Spalder. Let's say we're a Breton. Um, Rejuvenation. We're not an Arc, so we're not gonna put anything here. I should make this a drop down though. Later. Stained by Suffering and Necromagration. Let's just say I don't know. We're a DK, for instance. If we're a DK, we're not a Warden, so none of this applies. The only thing that applies is Major, Minor Intellect, and a support passive. And for this example, we're in 7 heavy, so 0 light armor help. We don't always have Minor Intellect on a DK, unfortunately. So let's just remove it for now. Scribing is going to help with that, though. Scribing will
Right.
make it easier to access Minor Intellect if you wanted to have it. Then we go here, Magicka Steel. So Magicka Steel is something that's going to be always present in a trial and almost never present in a dungeon. So essentially, are you in a dungeon or in a trial box? So let's say we're in a dungeon. We have the potion. 7 heavy, so 7 constitution. We don't use balance, and we're not. And we do have, since we're RDK, we have combustion. Let's just say we're using Elisus as the only thing to proc combustion, so let's just say it's half effective. So it procs every 6 seconds, essentially. We get 1 synergy every 20 seconds. I think in a dungeon you don't get too many. So
Right.
I think 1 every 20 seconds is generous sometimes, but
Sure.
um,
We've all been. I need a synergy. I need a synergy. For the love of God.
yeah. Max mag, let's say 17,000, at least for this build. And so if you put it all together, this right here is essentially the double check. So you would open your character sheet, and you either have no jewelry and you would compare this number, or you can compare with jewelry mag region this number. So whichever one you are comparing it to, this is essentially just, are you sure you plugged everything in correctly section.
Okay.
Now we select kind of what we want to compare. So we're comparing triple infused mag recovery to triple infused cost reduction. That's the current comparison. And then this is essentially the data you get. This is the raw magicka you get every 2 seconds, including regen and the additional stuff outside of it. And so on this build, we're either sitting out 4.4 with a regular build, well, with mag regen, or 3.2 with cost reduction. Now, which one's better? That's what this number is, the break-even skill cost. Now, I have a bit of an explanation here, because I don't assume people are going to understand what this number means.
Sure.
But, so 3773, essentially. So what this number is it effectively tells you any skill above this is going to be better with mag regen. Any skill below this value is better off with cost reduction. Now, does that make sense so far or not?
Yeah. I'm following you here. We've got a few people in chat. Guys, let us know if you want us to go back over anything. I look at this stuff all the time as well, so fairly familiar. And obviously, I looked at it a bit before we were chatting today. But I think so far we're good. What Amar? Hey, how's it going? Anybody else
Quick
in chat?
question though. Are you streaming on YouTube or Twitch as well?
Just on YouTube right now.
Okay.
Yeah. And this will be available. It goes up immediately afterwards. So. Yeah. So yeah, I think we're all tracking with you there. So basically, and this before I think we played with some of the numbers was still at like 30, 32 100. So still,
Yeah.
you know, in most situations, kind of what I think we all typically recommend is reduce cost is better there. Do you also have for? Oh yeah, you have Harmony infused down below. Okay.
Yeah. So in this instance,
Hey
you're on a
Monty.
DK, so most of your abilities would be cheaper, but not all of them. There are two very notable exceptions that are above this number, and they are Coag and Igneous Shield. Both of those values are above 4,000. So on a DK, what I generally recommend is mainly focusing on hardened armor. So unless you need to heal or shield someone else, mainly use hardened armor with Cinderstorm. That way you're kind of maximizing using cheaper skills to stay alive. And then when you need it, so when you need to heal someone else or you're low health yourself, that's when you use Igneous Shield and Coag
Sure.
because of this. Now, how do I generally make my DK? Knowing like my two of my most important skills are above and most of them are below. I usually run one mag regen and two cost reductions because I got this value and I wasn't sure like okay, it's like dead in the middle of my skills. Like half of them are above, half of them are below. What should I use? So I just did a bunch of testing and just felt played around with it until I got to what feels the best. And now I just recommend one mag regen and two cost reduction
Okay.
for this setup.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because a lot of people are like Harmony, Harmony, and as someone who runs in all different kinds of groups, um, Harmony is a really bad choice
The
for
way I view
a lot of
Harmony
groups.
is, yeah. So the way I view Harmony is it's situational. So I generally stick to my usual setup that doesn't involve Harmony. The only reason I would switch to Harmony is if I'm either doing a weird build or it's a hard enough fight where I need the extra stam sustain.
Right.
You don't really go Harmony for extra max sustain. Usually your max sustain, unless you're getting like a lot of synergies, your max sustain will either stay the same or become a little worse with Harmony. Um, but you mainly
Yeah.
go Harmony for the extra stam. So fights like, say, Basse or Teleria main tank, fights that require a lot of extra stamina, more than you usually would get, that's when I would potentially switch to Harmony if I needed to.
Yeah. On a class that's not typically run, or a race rather that's not typically run, or what have you. Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that's a lot about this. I just wanted to kind of show off this spreadsheet that you've made here. Maybe we should jump ahead and start talking about some of the damage mitigation, and maybe you could tell us. So, for those who don't know, Zos has made several updates recently talking about some of the stuff, but I think it was all sparked by your findings. Can you kind of tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So this is the original spreadsheet that I made. It's inaccurate. Well, it's not inaccurate. It's accurate when you use it sparingly, I should say. So
There's
these
some issues with
values
it.
right here, they're not exactly correct, all of them.
Okay.
I guess the best way I can explain it is by looking here. So this is the updated version. Um, so the way ZOS actually does this, which is what took me so long to figure out, and the people that were helping me, I also want to give credit to them. Um,
Well,
it's actually multiplication. What?
and I think all this came out because you got to like you displayed
I got to
that you could get to
100%
hundred
mitigation. Yeah.
percent damage mitigation. Yeah, you have a video on your channel here on YouTube, right?
Yeah. So the
Yeah.
way I did it was I had Lucent. Well, I'm gonna unselect Lucent at the moment because it was broken at the time. So I used Esoteric Greaves, um,
Yeah, Cat. We're kind of
Minor
chatting about it.
Aegis, and
We're
Armor
not to the
Death.
new stuff yet.
So as you can see, this gets me down to 34% mitigation, which isn't quite enough to cross over that 100 barrier. But the recent nerf, this is post nerf. So before nerf, so say PTS week 1, Lucent was additive, so it would be minus 20 right here. So Lucent would make it 14. And then to top it off, heavy armor and or preparation, heavy armor, and hardy were all additive as well. So we actually got to
Going
like
in five,
oh my
4,
bad.
3,
We got to
2,
like -3.
1.
That's how I was able to get to 100% is because uh, there were, while the whole thing wasn't additive, there were parts of it that were
that
additive.
were okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen some of my testing that it's you can get down to 15, 19 easy percent damage taken pretty easily. So another
Hmm.
20% is pretty easily going to put you into that invuln state.
But yeah, so now if you see this ginormous equation, it's actually pretty simple. But what ZOS did is they just have a round up after every multiplication. So you do one multiplication, you round up, you do one multiplication, you round up, etc. That's how this
Okay.
section is done, and which is also why this number right here is never it's never going to have decimal points. You're never going to see decimal points on this number. It's just going to be 34, 35. It's always going to be like a whole percent.
Okay. Just to
Um
probably reduce load on calculations, we assume.
yeah, but because this is always a whole percentage, that's why I thought it was additive. Um
Okay.
that was my assumptions. Like, okay, so if it's
Well,
always a whole percentage, that means it doesn't multiply,
yeah. Well,
which is why. Hmm.
I just want to say this stuff is incredibly like back solving for all this stuff is a lot harder than just having it like orders of magnitude harder. So I know that some people were very, very critical that your math was wrong or something, but clearly you figured out something that uh, nobody else had.
Well, my initial math was technically wrong. So this is the initial sheet, um, and it's correct when you use it with like one or two things. If you use it normally, so preparation, hardy, your heavy armor, your minor ages, etc. If you just do that without going like hard into it, it works fine. Now you see there is no Sigic in this sheet. There is no esoteric. There's nothing like that. There's nothing that's really big.
Okay.
It's all fairly small values, and there's the reason for that. Because if you use big values or a lot of additive things, well, I call them additive in this section, but it's in this spreadsheet, but they're not actually additive.
Yeah, that's fine. We can
It
talk
wouldn't
about
really
the
work, and that's why I kind of brought up those penalties in my post. I believe here, yeah, which is why I brought up the penalties in this section because I thought that's how they were being done, but it wasn't penalties.
okay.
So how I found out that it wasn't penalties is someone from ZOS actually did get back to one of my friends and say, "Oh, he's close, but there are no penalties."
Okay.
And I'm like, That's why I was like, okay, hold on. Now that we were definitively told there are no penalties, how else could it work? And that's what essentially Monday was. It was me
Okay.
trying to figure out how does this thing work without penalties, and that's how I got this whole rounding thing. Because
Okay.
I was like, if, hmm
Oh, I was just gonna say. So you have this updated right now based on like the feedback and everything.
yeah, this should be correct.
Okay.
I've given this spreadsheet to several people. I think they're all testing it now
Okay.
because so there is one problem with this kind of calculation is that if you look carefully, you see it's not in a row. It's not 12, 13, 14. It switches around. So it's 24, 14, 17. The order which you multiply them in, if you round up after every step, actually matters.
Matters. Okay.
Um,
Uh,
that's that's the kind of the main issue right now. We don't know definitively the order. I did a
okay.
bunch of testing. This is the order I got, starting from bottom to the top. Sigic looked like it was early in the calculation, while ascribing was fairly late. We think, or we speculate, that it's in order of release, but there are a few inconsistencies with it. For instance, major ages seems to come pretty late compared to minor ages, even though they weren't released that far apart.
Okay. Yeah, this is the difficult part of this, the testing required. I can't believe that you and like I've done a decent amount of this stuff, and it just takes so much time. So you're a saint for doing it for everybody.
Um, yeah.
So
So I guess I should go over what's nerfed compared to live versus Gold Road.
yeah, that'd be great.
Um, so currently I have the regular mitigation up here, and then I have new mitigation. Um, Now, yes, this is technically wrong, but the stuff I'm going to talk about is correct enough for it to be extremely accurate. To start off, you see right here we have an additive penalty section and a section I called what Zoss calls multiplication. Um, I just cannot call it multiplication because this is not multiplication. Rounding up after every step. I don't know what you want to call it, but
Uh,
no, I refuse to call that multiplication. Um, Regardless, so what happens is there's a bunch of things that you multiply together first, and then you add the penalties, which is the only thing remaining.
okay,
Before, preparation, hardy, and the heavy armor were additive. So they were right here in this additive section with magical and martial penalties and the fire damage increase from vampirism.
okay,
All right. So this resulted in a significantly higher number because, for instance, you would have so necro dot mitigation. You would have major aegis and say 50% vampirism. This would be 32, right here. But before, this is post update. But before, it wouldn't actually be 32. It'd be 32 minus heavy armor, and then minus preparation, minus hardy. So this number would be really low. It'd be like 0. Well, 10, 2, and 7 if you have 7 heavy and it's against physical. So this would be like 19 lower.
okay,
So it would be like, well, you can imagine.
yeah,
Point being is,
point
this
three.
would be a lot lower than it was. And that's because it was incorrectly added. It shouldn't have been added, it should have been multiplied. Because of the fact that it was being added, mitigation was just a lot higher in general in ESO for everyone. The reason why it's hitting necros, for instance, harder is because they already have a bunch of multiplicative things in here, and now though those multiplicative things don't have a base to just push them up anymore. So it's just multiplication without that 10 or 12% pushing them up.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so while a DK or something would only use like one thing from here, Necros had multiple, so it hit them a
yeah.
bit
It
harder.
it kind of seemed like a lot of the bespoke
Mm-hmm.
uh, damage mitigation things, kind of some of the unusual stuff. A lot of that, for some reason, ended up being kind of additive. Necro being kind of
Mm-hmm.
falling into that category. At least that's how I read
Yeah.
it, as someone who looks at all this stuff all the time. So
Mm-hmm. There is no longer any additives
okay.
bonuses in ESO but with Gold Road. Once Gold Road launches, as far as I know, I don't see any more additive things.
So
So
what?
it's all going to be multiplicative.
Yeah. So what does that
Mm-hmm.
mean for tanks, for PvP, for that kind of situation moving forward?
It means that physical damage, because heavy armor was being added, um, that means physical damage. Tanks are going to take roughly 5% more damage than they were live, which isn't really a big notice. No one's really going to notice that too much. 5%. Like, how often do you go below 5% and then manage to pull through? Right?
Right. Right.
Barely happens, if it happens at all. So most tanks aren't really going to feel the difference. Now, necro tanks will feel the difference a bit more because compared to physical dots, so they will feel physical dots a bit more. It'll be like 10%. Now, before everyone starts going insane, there are very few physical dots in the game, and I do mean there are very few. while there may be quite a few that are like regular bleeds or whatever, but those don't do a lot of damage in the first place. They're like one or two. If you think about all the hard hitting dots, they're all magical.
Okay,
Like
so like
fire from Stoneguard and fire from Behemoths, Teleria, that's frost damage, Bosse main tank, that's also frost damage. It's all magical. The
sure, the
place where Necro will really get hit is the opening section of Bossic, because those A bombs are physical. So against those A bombs specifically, you will take like 10% more damage than you would used to on a Necro.
okay. And also for all
Now,
the necro tanks
mhm,
out there. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
no, go on.
No, I was going to say also for all the necro tanks out there and tanks in general. Actually, you're probably getting to this point. You're probably building to this, but we are also getting more sources of damage mitigation, and everybody's going to be able to use a shield moving forward. So we're also like probably we're still net positive in my mind.
We're also getting this is physical damage reduction. The thing is, magical is barely changing because magical had like a penalty essentially. Because light armor, as it still is on ATS, it was subtractive. So whatever kind of bonuses you would get from preparation and whatever, it was just subtracted away for the light armor for magical damage if you're wearing heavy armor.
Okay.
So magical damage is hit a lot less. So on most builds, you'll be taking like 2 to 3% more magical damage. On a necro, where it was 10 physical, it's only going to be like 4 to 5% magical. So magical damage is almost unaffected. It is affected a little, but not nearly as much as physical damage is. So we can almost ignore the magical damage increases.
Okay.
And yes, we are getting Lucent Echoes next patch, which is honestly one of the best sets ever. It's probably going to be a staple for dungeons, and there's probably going to be a lot of raid groups that use it. I know for my group, I'm planning to drop both Saxes. I'm just going to drop Major Force entirely. I'm going to run mainly Lucent Echoes with a few other buffs to get up to crit cap.
Okay. Yeah, I actually just did. I think it released earlier in the week. My kind of my suggestion, which was Lucent Echoes and Pearl Sax, so that kind of stuff. But yeah, yeah, and because Lucent Echoes, it does, since it buffs damage and it provides that damage mitigation, is kind of a no brainer. Feels like so. It's a good
In
set.
dungeons, it's going to be especially good because there isn't really a good way to keep up major force in dungeons. Like, sure, you can have sacks, but that's like what 30 seconds, and then you have to wait for God knows how long to get another 500 gold to get the same amount. So usually force uptime in dungeons aren't great. Well, I this is actually Lucent is kind of the inspiration for this sheet right here.
Okay.
Um, I wanted to see how much Lucent would boost it. So a typical DPS in a dungeon. This is like a typical DPS loadout. So medium armor, um, minor force, arcanist, minor brittle, not always present in a dungeon, but let's just say it is. Let's say you have a good tank. You're currently at 109. So yes, major force boosts you to over, but like major force isn't always up. So if we plug in the 109 here and then we put an 11, so Lucent's going to buff your damage throughout the whole fight by 4.2%. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's actually massive. Because if we compare to Pearlescent Ward, so I currently have just a DPS spec in here. We just turn on Pearlescent Ward for this DPS. You see they're only doing 2.6% more damage. Pearlescent Ward is a fairly minimal buff. So people are wearing Pearlescent Ward popularly right now in dungeons. I know it's not for the damage boost; it's mainly for the damage reduction. But for a tank that's wearing Pearlescent now, that's going to swap to Lucent, that's going to be like almost double the effectiveness of a 5-piece set. So it's
Yeah.
going to be quite a significant damage increase to swap from Pearlescent to Lucent in a dungeon.
Cool. And you have also here the new comparative mitigation. So if someone wants to, if they're really worried, they can come here and check this out and see what's the situation is versus live versus what's going to be.
Well, no, this isn't that type of comparative
Oh,
mitigation.
okay. I'm sorry.
This is just you want to compare two different builds. So say how important are resistances. So what if I'm at, well, what happened? What's going on?
Everything's fine over here.
Okay, my screen is going blank. Okay.
All right.
All right.
Everything's looked fine over here, so not sure what it
Okay.
is.
But say we have 30,000 resistances on this tank versus 33,100 on this tank. Like, how much do 3,000 resistances really matter? And right here, you get 8.5% mitigation. Like, this is what the sheet is for. It's comparing, like, how much additional damage are you going to take?
Okay. Cool. Well, that's I mean, I think that's incredibly helpful for tanks and for people to see what the difference is. And then you had originally, maybe you still have it as you're using the damage from VAS. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, as your
155,478. Yep.
I recognize that number. I've been in there enough. Cool, which is the amount of damage you take from unblocked, unmitigated heavy from the big metal dragon and Veterum Asylum Sanctorum. Okay, cool. And did you use
I mean,
the ground dot
mhm,
for the damage over time in
yeah.
there? Is that what that is? Okay.
53613. Yep. So whenever I need to test AoE or damage over time, I would use this number.
So are you overall? Are you pretty happy with the changes that ZOS has made? Do you think there's more stuff that needs to be changed here, or you feel okay with it?
Uh, I'm okay with it as of now. What they could do, what I think they should do, they should add like a 5% addition to this category right here. That's because currently, um, I mean, I can literally demonstrate. For instance, if we take necrotic or disdain harm, like it says 15% in game, right? But what does it actually give you? What's going on? All right, right here. But you see, it's like 14.44444. It's not the full value.
Yeah, and why is that? Because, like, for
Because
example, necrotic potency at 0.3 actually only ends up being a little over 2%, right? Which is one of the
yeah,
main passives you'd usually keep up on a
it's
necro tank.
2.222 necrotic potency. Yeah.
Yeah, and why is
Why
that
is
number?
that?
Yeah,
Yeah, well, the reason why that is because of this base game mitigation. So this 155478 isn't technically the damage you take. This is the damage you take after a 10% reduction to damage. Because you can't remove this base game, it's always there, it's always present. Which I guess is kind of a counterpoint that this section does not need any additional damage mitigation. Because technically, if I were to turn this off on both, and then I would do 15, it is 15, right? That's assuming you took the actual damage that Ohms is doing and not this value that you take on a naked tune. Does that make sense?
yeah. Yeah, but when you look at it as a player and you see, okay, I've taken,
As a player, yeah, you don't really know that this base game thing is on all the time. The only way to really find out is either A, do the math until you figure out how it works and you figure that out, or read patch notes from 3 years ago that mention all players now have a 10% mitigation.
right. Yeah, so I mean, it's really confusing if it says 3%. A player would expect it's 3%, and then they're only going to see a 2.2%, which is
Yeah,
pretty
so
massive.
the reason why this happens is because you would multiply this 10% with, say, this 15, and then you would round it down, and then you keep rounding down. I don't know why ZOS did it this way, but after every operation, it rounds down or rounds up, however you want to look at it. But basically, it's worse for the player. The rounding is always essentially down or worse for the player.
Rounds up
So if
your
you say,
rounds up
mhm,
your damage taken, rounds down your damage mitigation. Right. Sorry, I just want to make sure the round up
He
versus
is.
round down. Just want to
Yeah.
make that clear. Okay.
You take more damage because of the rounding, not less. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why this comes out to like 14.4444 damage mitigation.
Okay.
Because if you were to multiply 0.15 times base game, that would be 10% times 15%, or 0.9 times 0.85. I guess I can do a quick. So you'd expect 0.765, and if I were to plug in 0.765 in here, as you can see, it's 15%.
Right.
But because of the rounding that ZOS does on their end, we only get 14.44.
Okay. Right. Which is, rounding error is notoriously bad in, in science because it does add up over time, especially when you're talking about, 15, 20 sources of damage mitigation here, right?
And that's kind of like, I don't really understand why it's done this way, because you see this section right here? This is multiplicative, completely and utterly, no rounding.
Huh.
This section right here.
Okay.
They have, so Ironclad, it's exactly 6%. Duelist rebuff, exactly 6%. It's gonna be exact.
So for those who
Um,
are PvP focused moving forward, hopefully we shouldn't see any more, vampires running around that are literally untouchable. Is that
for
safe to
PvP,
say? Yeah, I'm wondering about what the problems are potentially moving forward. Do you feel like most of it's been solved? I guess is the question I'm trying to
if
ask.
we're talking about getting less mitigation for PvP, yes, that would happen. Because for PvP, as far as I understand, it was made. A lot of it was this number right here, and
Yeah,
then plus, I know preparation doesn't work in PvP, but hardy does, and so does heavy armor. So if you were trying to attack someone with heavy armor with physical damage, and they were also a vamp, that's like hitting a wall with your fist. It wasn't really gonna go anywhere.
yeah,
Next patch, the bonuses are being moved to multiplication, so it's not going to be as bad as just being added to this section. Um, so in terms of that, they will take more damage. That's essentially what tanks are experiencing in ESO PvE
cool.
as well.
And I see you've got up there too the scribing changes. Did you take a look at that with the added mitigation that we can get compared to the damage taken? It should more than make up for it, correct? Or
Well, this 30% scribing ability is very hard to keep up, so that one's not really realistic to keep up in
okay,
scenarios. Because it's like a 2-second duration. So good luck, I guess.
yeah, that's fair. That's
Um,
fair.
Scribing the 8%, yeah, this thing is multiplicative. It's about 10 seconds, I think a little less, maybe like 8 seconds. Uh, you can keep it up. If you really need it or need more mitigation, it would help. Um, as an option, yeah.
Yeah. Well, cool, man. Is there anything we, missed that we want to go over? I don't want to keep you too long here. I said I wouldn't keep you more than an hour here.
Oh, no worries. I have at least 2 hours if you really want to go on. It's not an issue.
uh, yeah. Is there anything
Um,
else that you wanted to that we've missed or we haven't talked about?
I guess we can go over guard and maim. So right here we have a section where I say it's additive with each other. So a lot of necro tanks don't understand how important Spirit Guardian is. Like they're like, oh, 10% damage reduction, that's important, right? But it's actually, if you pair it with guard, it's additive. So it's 0.6. So what does that tell us? That it's actually 14.2% damage mitigation. So it's actually quite powerful to have Spirit Guardian up on Base if
Oh,
you're trying to
okay.
take less damage.
Wow. Okay. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
So there are still some things that are being added. Then is what you're saying. That's
They're
one of the things.
additive, but they're like additive with each other. It's
Sure, sure,
not.
but yeah, yeah, yeah. But still, that's Yeah, are there anything else that's like? Oh, it looks like the MAMEs are the major or
Mames
major.
are the same story, yeah.
Okay,
Stacking major mame with minor mame is also quite effective.
okay. So just to like back of the napkin math for everybody. So normally what you would do is you'd say, okay, whatever your damage mitigation was doesn't really matter, or whatever damage taken, and then you've got a situation where you're going to take 10% less damage, and then you got a situation where you take another 5% less damage. You multiply those each one of those numbers. So let's say you had 80% damage mitigation, and then you multiply times zero point 0.1 and then you multiply times 0.5, you're going to get a much smaller number than, or not maybe not much smaller number. You're going to get a smaller number than is if you say zero point 0.8 times 0.15, adding those two together. Sorry, I just want to make that really clear so that people understand. I know we look at all this stuff all the time, and so for us, it can be uh, pretty easy to pick up on or what have you, but it can be quite a bit. I know.
Um, I guess something worthy of note. I did mention it, but I don't know if it's quite, if it was really noticeable. But these are penalties, so they are added to the multiplication. So say you have major, minor ages. You have all this stacked stuff. You got yourself down to like a lot of mitigation. You're all the way down to 32. If you're a stage 4 vamp and someone's hitting you with vampirism, 20% just immediately gets removed. There's just additive penalties.
Okay. So for
So
PvP, go with fire damage. If
for
you're running,
PvP, if you're going against a vamp, yes, they will really suffer. That's why vampirism, even in PvE, is. Are you sure you want to take that extra, a lot of fire damage?
yeah. Are the
Granted,
various? Do you know if the
mm-hmm.
various buffs and or debuffs that you get are also additive? So if we get the inverse of some of these buffs, for example, getting minor maim or major maim on a person, do you know if that's additive? Because
I haven't really tested
we'll
anything to
we'll leave.
do with player reduction.
Okay,
No.
we'll leave that for the audience, I guess, for anybody who's PvP focused. That would be interesting to see, because that could be one of the issues too with people feeling so tanky. Is just that maybe getting more debuffs on them could have a significant.
Considering Major Mame is additive for bosses, I don't see why it wouldn't be additive on the player.
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking. But it's Zoss though, so we should probably check. No offense, Zoss.
Yeah. I guess I can also go over, if we're talking about mitigation, I guess block mitigation is also pretty important.
Okay.
Um, a lot of people don't understand how powerful this number really is. They're like, oh yeah, block mitigation. Like people complain about Scrivenger's Hall, for instance, or Earthen Root. If you just max out your block mitigation, you just immediately 89% less damage, and that's by itself without even touching anything else. Um, so block mitigation cap is 90, but you can get to 89 without anything really. You're just, if you're a DK or a Plar with defensive stance, bracing anchor, and then the regular passives with 7 heavy, you're essentially at almost mitigation cap for block. Not quite there. And if you're say not a DK, so you don't have this 5%, you would be at 84, which is still pretty high. But say you really need to get to that maximum, you could always throw on a movable, and that easily gets you to cap every time.
Yeah. Cool. Which is the heavy
Well,
armor skill for those who don't know.
yeah, so obviously if you don't have a lot of the buffs, so say you don't have defensive stance or bracing anchor, like it's not gonna get you there completely, so you still would need something. Especially if you wear like a 5-1-1 setup, like you're missing quite a bit. So you would need you would need bracing anchor, and even with bracing anchor, if you're in a 5-1-1 setup, you wouldn't completely get to resistance cap with a movable. You could go a little more. 6 heavy would get you there. 7 would get you way over. But if you were to stick with 5-1-1, what you could do is you could use the on guard CP to get you over. That also works.
Yeah, and for again, um, for a lot of the tanks out there, if they wanted to try this, they can. The link I have it linked down here. Obviously, there's other places. I know we're in like 10 different discords together, so you're also in every discord. But they can just go up here, go to find this tanking tools link, file, and then
Hmm.
they can copy this whole thing, and then they can fill in and do whatever they need to do on this to kind of figure it out for themselves.
Yep, I made this so people can just try it out for themselves, see what works. Resistance is actually something I also use quite a bit. Um, Now we all know the sources of resistances, but like you don't really want to make everything to then try it on and see where you'll end up. Um, so that's kind of the idea. Also, a lot of people don't realize how detrimental going 511 is to your resistances. It's 2,500 physical resistances and 1766 spell, which is why I added this little section right here. Uh, And a lot of people are like, oh yeah, go reinforced all the time. And like, sure, going reinforced is nice and all, but it's only 1,600 resistances. Or 1,500, sorry, if you're wearing 511. So it's not even. It doesn't even cover for the spell resistances lost, let alone the physical. The physical is almost 1,000 higher. So a
That's a
lot
good
of.
point.
So sturdy isn't essentially like out of the picture yet. Or isn't out of the picture because there's so many ways to get the resistance cap. You can really use whatever trait you want, but you have to be mindful of your resistances as well. For instance, just literally just going 7 heavy will get you quite high. So in this setup right here, we're just 7 heavy with a shield. Let's just major minor resolve. Let's say we're at DK. We don't have defending. We're already at 29. That's without Nord. That's without anything. If we're wearing Crimson, that's almost armor cap. We're right there. A little bit under. Or if we're a Nord, that gets us extremely close. We could also just literally slot Fortified
Now, I
with
have
any of the previous
heard it.
statements.
I have heard it
Hmm.
said historically that the last bit of resistances mattered more than the first bit of
Yes.
resistances. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, sure. Um, it all has to do with this value right here. So whenever you multiply, so it's actually a good example right here. So let's get resistances to 6, 6. Uh, just getting resistances to a point where they're a full number. All right, close enough. So say here resistances are, you have 6,000 resistances repeating. So you get to 98% or 10% mitigation from your resistances. Now,
What
you
Amara?
have
I
a
will
skill.
absolutely.
So say you have minor protection, right, which
Hmm.
is 5%, and crowd control CP. You would expect this, like it's not additive, so it's only 4.7. So that's essentially similar to what resistances are happening. Because these two are added together, so they're both 10%, but these are multiplied together, while the resistances is just added 10%.
Right.
So the more you push resistances up, the higher that percentage becomes, all the way to 50%. I typed in a random number, but there.
Yeah. So it's not so much that it's
33,100.
additive. It's additive with other
It is
resistances.
additive.
Well,
It's
it's
additive with itself. That's
yeah
the
with
thing. Yeah.
itself, right, but it's not additive into the whole. So yeah, I guess it depends how you want to say it. I suppose
No, it
maybe that was
is. The more resistances you have, you're basically every 660 resistance points, you add 1%. So it's literally plus one, plus one. That's why, and the more you scale it, the more effective it becomes. And same thing with actually block cost. Um, a lot of people think, oh, 30 isn't even as good as one infused block enchant or whatever. I'd like to point out that 3 regular block cost enchantments is equal to a full sturdy build. Almost on pretty close.
Yeah.
So
So when we're talking about this, let me just make sure I understand. So when we're talking about, so you're not saying that the first 660 resistances are more important or less important than the last 660, right? You're just saying that resistances in general, the way they are added in, it's more important in general.
no, it's just how multiplication essentially. Well, okay. All right, so 660 is 1%. But the thing is, you're not doing 0.99 times 0.99 times 0.99 repeating, right? You're not doing that. You're adding them together and then throwing them in together. So it would be,
Right.
so say,
So a 5% reduction in damage taken from resistances is greater than a 5% damage reduction in damage taken from minor protection because
if
you're
you're closer to the armor cap, yes.
yeah, okay,
Because you're instead of multiplying that 5% by itself, what major protection does, it's just taking 5% and you're multiplying that in. You're instead taking a 45% value and then adding 5% to that value, making it 50%, and then you're multiplying that out. So you're adding 5% to something that already has a very high value, boosting both values, essentially.
right, right. I guess it's all about perspective. Okay, cool. Thank you for clarifying. I did have a question here. Well, I'm sorry, I might have
Oh.
interrupted you. I think you were finished, but you tell me if you weren't.
I mean, no, I was just going to say that people really, I've seen a lot of people sacrifice magic recovery enchantments to run divines on the body and run a infused block enchant on your jewelry, and that is a very bad thing you can do because one sturdy piece lowers it by 42, or it should be 42, 44, 42ish, around there. Every single point, every single sturdy lowers it by essentially 4%. And it's, you see, there's no diminishing return because sturdy as resistances are added together and then multiplied in. So it's not 4% times 4% times 4%. No, you're adding them together first and then multiplying in. So every additional sturdy piece is more effective than the last in terms of reducing your
And I'm sorry, what
overall
what was the thing
cost.
that you see people doing a lot that you don't recommend? Can you repeat that again?
Putting mag regen on the body, so going divines right here.
Yeah.
So divines only is like 28, which you need 10 divines pieces or 9 with change to match one infused mag regen glyph, right? So that's essentially 10 divines pieces to match one mag regen glyph. But to do the same thing with sturdy, you only need like 5.
So it'd make a lot more sense if you need more mag recovery to not have a sturdy
You would,
glyph and have not
so
have a
instead of sacrificing, yeah, exactly. Almost you're essentially sacrificing 10 divines pieces to run 4 on the body, and then you're using a block enchantment, an infused block enchantment, when you could have just put a, you could have had the same exact block cost if you just used 430, for
yeah.
instance.
Well, and I
Uh,
think I think another thing that people don't realize is that like when you look at sturdy, each piece gives you 4% block cost reduction, and most of the traits it depends on what it is, but it'll vary based on the size of the piece. So a belt, if you make a reinforced belt, it's going to give you almost no increase
you
resistances.
never want to make a reinforced belt.
Yeah, exactly. You
Now
it,
you can do a Nernhone belt if you really were strapped for resistances, but never make a reinforced belt. That's worse than Nernhone.
okay, there you go. Yeah, but going with something like sturdy on that makes a lot of sense because you get maximum benefit from such a small piece compared to what you could otherwise. It's the opportunity cost, I guess. Yeah, the one question, and that we have in chat right now is, and actually there might be a couple more coming in. But Wedamar is just asking for, in terms of build guidelines and stuff moving forward. I would say that I don't think anybody needs to change anything on their build. But is there anything that I'm
Nothing's
missing?
changing for build. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Nothing's really changing going forward next patch in terms of mitigation. You're getting some shield skills with scribing if you want to use those. So that's an option. But what you could do is you could really, if anyone's listening in now and just wants to become a better tank or just wants to be able to tank more stuff, learn this thing. Um, for me, I was an experienced tank. I was playing for 5 years. When I made this thing, Scavenger's Hall became significantly easier because I didn't realize just how effective. Like everyone runs flare these days, right? So everyone's like, oh, everyone just run major protection, right? Because it's just 10%. I never realized just how important defensive stances when it comes to fights where you need to block. For instance, just comparing, if you were to remove flare and run only defensive stance, you would take 30% more damage with flare than if you ran defensive stance. That blew my mind. When I first threw this together, I was like, defensive stance, you take 30% less damage with defensive stance. I
Yeah.
was like, damn. So this is a block fight. So anytime you need to block, which is your Fall Graven, Scavenger's Hall, Archdruid, any of those fights which are heavily block related, you need to get that block mitigation up as high as possible because it's the same principle. You're taking a very high number and you're adding 5% to it because that's what most of the stuff. I know defensive stance says 10 on the tooltip, but it's like 10 divided by 2. So it's 5%. But like adding 5% to an already absurdly high number just makes it even higher, which is why the mitigation comes out to be nuts.
Yeah, and just a real quick note that's incredibly important that a lot of people, the game does not tell you this, but you can block direct damage. You cannot block damage over time. And so that's why a lot of things recently have done a lot of damage over time, but that's not true with everything. And it's not true in a lot of dungeons, which is what we're primarily talking about with some of this stuff, where block mitigation does matter a lot in those situations. And though we've kind of gone over it, how easy it is to get to block cap with just a few changes, you can't block damage over time. A lot of the new trials in particular do damage over time. So kind of keep that in mind.
Yeah, definitely. So I would still recommend you run major protection in most instances. That flare, it's not only major protection, it's also, 10% more recovery. So that's also
Right.
not something to be overlooked. So
10%
I
more
would
mag
definitely
recovery from
recommend
the
major flare in
passives.
most instances.
Yeah.
But for block fights like Scavenger's Hall and, as I said, Fallgraven Harmo, those, you really, really want that defensive stance. It's really powerful.
Cool. Yeah, that's
But But yeah, as any like beginner, intermediate, or end game tank, you need to understand this thing. Like if you want to minimize your damage taken, understanding this, just playing with it, this is gonna get your performance to the next level. Like I thought I was good when it comes to Skirmisher's Hall, but I was still struggling on many tank classes. Like I literally remember doing like all 7 tank classes in Skirmisher's Hall, but before I made the spreadsheet, and it was rough. It was kind of hard, and on some of them. Notably, the Necro was kind of rough. After learning this, and then learning how strong defensive stance is, I did it again on all 7, and they were all ridiculously easy because just knowing how to maximize your mitigation for any given fight is extremely valuable.
yeah. I can remember not too long ago struggling pretty hard on Fallgraven on a new build, doing some weird stuff. And it was and I was just taking so much damage and was just struggling so hard to stay alive. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're a DK, you can get to 89% block mitigation. If you get to 89% block mitigation, you don't need guard. Even without guard, as a DK with 89, you're taking like 8 to 9k attack.
Yeah, and I
8 to 9k light attack in execute. where all other tanks are gonna take like 30k per light attack
Yeah, and
with
I was on an
guard.
Arcanist. So,
Arcanist is gonna be it's gonna get you to that 84 if you do it right. If you didn't have defensive stance, you would have been at like 79, and that's with 7 heavy. If you were 5-1-1, it would be at like 77. So yeah, I can see how like I can actually plug it in.
yeah, and I actually did swap to a sword and board for that. I was running an ice staff, and that's what I ended up
You
doing.
were taking 43% more damage than you should have been.
Here we go.
So I can see how it would be harder for you. So just run sword and board, 7 heavy, with bracing anchor and defensive stance. You'll be taking a lot less damage.
Easy
A
mode.
lot. So that's kind of my biggest tip if you're going into ESO tanking. Understand how to minimize damage. And this is essentially the inspiration for the spreadsheet and why I made it, like to minimize the damage taken.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean that's again just a huge help for tanks. This can also be a huge help for anybody if you're running endless archive and you're trying to survive some of those heavy attacks. Um, you know, those are heavy attacks of direct damage. So getting your block mitigation up as a DPS can really help you survive that. Yeah. Well, cool, man. Well, yeah, I don't know. I think I'm out of questions here. This is really helpful. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with all of us. Um,
Yeah, of course.
is there anything that you want to plug or anybody where we should go check you out? Or do you stream on Twitch? Is that my
I
understanding?
do stream on Twitch. I stream Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, but I don't really interact. It's just my prog day.
Okay,
I just stream our VSC runs. That's it.
cool. Yeah, and hopefully everybody knows you can always come by the That Wasn't the Boss Discord. We have help channels there. Very smart people. Many that know, like Spark here, that probably know more than I about this stuff. So yeah, but I think we'll call the stream here if we don't have any more questions. And yeah, thanks again, Spark, for taking a few minutes to chat with me, man. I appreciate it.
Yep, no worries.
All right, guys, we'll catch you later. Thanks everybody for dropping in. Drop more questions if you have it after the fact in chat here.